It was my job to take care of you.
We were supposed to take care of each other. And we did.
While Halo 4 was a controversial title among longtime fans, it certainly left its mark on the franchise. And for new developer 343 Industries, it was a bold statement of intent for where they would be taking the franchise and the Master Chief going forward. It was clear that they wanted to explore his character and give him some more depth, while also being faithful to how he was characterized both in the primary and extended universe works. Halo 4's story had glaring issues with its exposition and cohesiveness between its macro and micro narratives, but its primary goal of being the impetus for a more interesting main character was achieved. The Chief's duty as a soldier was tested, his self-othering from the rest of humanity was called into question, and, despite succeeding in his mission to save humanity once again, he failed to save Cortana from her own natural degradation. More than anything, this personal failure is what broke the Chief, even for a moment, and having this as the game's emotional climax is what cemented 343's intentions. Some fans weren't particularly interested in this direction, others were, and I was most definitely in the latter camp. It's been nearly a decade since Halo 4, but now we have Halo Infinite, 343 Industries' third mainline entry in the franchise, and I'm going to be upfront about this. Halo Infinite is a wonderful blossoming of the seeds planted in Halo 4, continuing the exploration of the Master Chief's character that began with baby steps back in 2012, and not only bringing it more to the surface, but doing so beautifully. But I'm sure plenty of you have already read the title of this video, and are ready to take to the comments in an attempt to lambast the very idea that Infinite met the expectations of fans following an uncharacteristically long development cycle, and to call me a 343 shill for even suggesting that it's in any way satisfying or completely put together. And to those of you coming into this with such a mindset, I'll say this. Settle down, hold your pitchforks, I know why you're frustrated, but I'm only here to talk about the story and characters. There are plenty of other videos out there that go in depth with the issues plaguing the multiplayer if you want to hear about that. This is not one of those videos. Hey, sorry about the weird edit. This is Future Andrew. As I was editing the video, 343 dropped the roadmap for Infinite going all the way into June-ish, which included pushing Season 3 back all the way to March and expanding Season 2 with a winter thing and delaying co-op and Forge again, canceling split screen entirely. I have a lot of thoughts on the multiplayer. This isn't the video for that, but the long and short of it is I was convinced that management at 343 Industries was really dropping the ball hard, but now I'm convinced something way worse is going on. I won't get into that here, but I will say that I don't blame the developers, the boots on the ground actually working on it, but I am shocked. I have no idea what's going on, but that is outside the scope of this video, and so now we're going back to our regularly scheduled programming. I'm not here to mindlessly praise Infinite or shut down any and all criticism of it, but rather I'm here to explore the strength of its writing, characterization, and most importantly, how Halo Infinite kept the promise. Ever since 343 Industries took control of Halo, the franchise has been on perpetually shaky ground. Halo 4 was intended to launch the franchise into a new era, with a new story, new art style, new enemies, and a new focus on the Master Chief as a character rather than a cypher. But despite delivering a compelling character story, Halo 4's external conflict and its gameplay, both in campaign and multiplayer, left a lot to be desired. 2014's The Master Chief Collection launched in such a broken state that it was effectively a coaster for most players, and Halo 5, while it somewhat reinvigorated the competitive scene and supercharged Forge mode, had a campaign which was not only seen as a colossal misstep from fans of all stripes, but as a whole seemed to tarnish the Halo name. With the reveal of Halo Infinite in 2018, fans grew anxious. While the Slipspace engine produced gorgeous visuals and the art style seemed to be a blend of the classic Bungie era and 343's own style, it wouldn't be until summer 2020 that we would see any actual gameplay, and what we saw was unimpressive at best and horribly undercooked at worst. even if we did get Craig from it. Combine this with where the story was going and how burned longtime fans had felt regarding the direction of the campaigns and multiplayer of recent installments, and the skepticism was more than warranted. Speaking of which... While I spent over an hour discussing Halo 4, the reason I haven't and almost certainly will never put together a Halo 5 retrospective is because I feel there's very little that I can actually add to the conversation surrounding it. It is the unambiguous black sheep of the series and has been discussed to death. So instead of making a separate video, I'm going to lay my cards on the table here regarding Halo 5, since we need to understand what happened both in that game's story and in the fandom to have proper context for Infinite. Released in 2015 and taking place a little over a year after 4, Halo 5 Guardians sees the Master Chief going AWOL and being hunted down by Spartan Jameson Locke, an assassin with the Office of Naval Intelligence. At least, that was the focus of the game's marketing, and while it isn't technically untrue, it is a bit misleading. The Chief goes rogue because, while on a mission, he has a vision of Cortana activating a large Forerunner construct while calling out to him. He assigns his team to go find her against the orders of their superiors because he feels that Cortana is his personal responsibility. Locke and Fireteam Osiris are tasked with hunting down the Chief and Blue Team for their insubordination, but not without a few detours along the way, which ultimately just try to elaborate on why Cortana is still alive and what she's doing with these Forerunner constructs, the Guardians. The Chief finds her and learns that she accessed the Forerunner domain, which cured her rampancy, and she now believes that AIs were meant to be the reclaimers and inheritors of the mantle of responsibility, not humanity. She's using the Guardians to enforce her rule, subjugating if not outright eliminating those who would rebel against her fascist regime. And she's already started to convert a whole host of AIs to her cause, which sends the UNSC into a tailspin. Osiris ultimately saves Blue Team from millennia of imprisonment inside a cryptum, and the game ends with the two teams and others coming together to begin planning a counterattack, as the Infinity goes into hiding and Cortana makes her moves on a Halo ring. The backlash to this story was immediate. Those who were still on board with where the story was going after Halo 4 felt that that game's emotional climax was undermined, if not completely trampled, by the decision to not only bring Cortana back, but to make her the villain. Fans who were here more to shoot aliens as their favorite super soldier were upset that they only got to play as the Master Chief for 3 of the game's 15 missions, the other 12 of which see them playing as Locke and Osiris, and 3 of those missions are just small environments where the player only interacts briefly with the scenery. For those who only follow the story through the games, the presence of a whole host of characters that they were expected to know without introduction, namely Blue Team and Osiris, sans Buck who became a Spartan between ODST and 5, as well as deeper parts of the lore surrounding the Forerunners, left them confused and struggling to follow along with whatever was happening, as well as detached from the characters because they aren't particularly well defined here. I was among the detractors, but after nearly 7 years of stewing on it, I realized that, broadly speaking, the basic beats and premise of Halo 5 honestly aren't that bad of a way of continuing Halo 4's story. Think about it. Halo 4 was mainly about humanizing the Chief, and this was done by putting him in situations where he had to defy his superiors for the good of humanity, while also trying to cope with the impending loss of his closest companion, Cortana. I won't retread that here, but if you want to know what I'm getting at, then go watch my video on Halo 4 to get a better understanding of where I'm coming from with this. With the Didact eliminated, there was no longer a headlining villain to carry over from 4 into 5. The Didact did have a monologue in the game's epilogue, but based on the information given earlier in the game about the Forerunners being at war with ancient humanity, and how the Didact seems to be addressing an unknown group, it can be easily taken as something he said prior to being imprisoned in his cryptum, rather than following his defeat at the hands of the Master Chief. And having the main enemy being either a new Covenant splinter faction or another evil Forerunner not only would have been retreading old ground, but also, theoretically, wouldn't present any sort of personal conflict for the Master Chief. They'd just be another bad guy for him to fight without any sort of emotional weight. We needed to have a villain who would challenge the Chief not just physically, as a soldier, but emotionally, as a human being. And since the Chief feels responsible for Cortana and guilty over her death, bringing her back as the villain and giving her control of the Prometheans and other Forerunner constructs does make a certain amount of sense. That being said, I think Halo 5 as it is executed this idea terribly. Not only do we spend the majority of the game playing as someone who isn't the Chief, but the story seems almost entirely uninterested in John as a character, outside of a few lines here and there. According to Fred, Chief's been pushing himself harder than usual, never allowing himself to rest since losing Cortana, which in real-life soldiers is a symptom of post-traumatic stress disorder. And as already mentioned, he feels a personal responsibility for Cortana, which is why he goes AWOL in the first place, and why Locke and the others are in the story. But what really kill Halo 5's story are the bloat and pacing. Too much irrelevant stuff happens with too many unnecessary characters, namely Osiris, and information is doled out haphazardly in a way that leaves little to the imagination prior to what should be big reveals. The most egregious of this is the revelation that Cortana is alive, which comes midway into the game's second mission. And while it's unclear at that point why she's back or what exactly she's doing, it's already undermined her death from Halo 4 as well as deflated a lot of the tension the story could have had in favor of confusion and frustration. Not much would have to be done to make Halo 5's story just a bit more palatable, and few elements would have to be added or removed. Remove Osiris from the plot. Build mystery and suspense around who's controlling the Prometheans, the Covenant Remnants, and the Guardians, the latter of which would emerge at the end of the first act. The Chief, with or without Blue Team, is sent to investigate, and either at the midpoint or end of the second act, Cortana is revealed, in the flesh so to speak, for the greatest emotional impact. She pulls back the curtain on what she's doing, John protests like in how the scene played out in the actual game, but this time Cortana doesn't imprison him. The player fights their way out of the chamber at the end of the mission, a la 343 Guilty Spark and Combat Evolved. The final act is about stopping her grand plan, but it's just a temporary setback for her. The cruel reality sets in for both John and Cortana that they are at war. They're enemies now, but neither knows if they could kill the other, and possibly change the Warden to be the real mastermind behind this, influencing Cortana to fulfill his plans while believing they're her own. John's regret and guilt over Cortana's death in Halo 4 would still be present and at the forefront of the story, and would be compounded by her face-heel turn. We'd also have a satisfying ending to the game's story, and still have a setup for the next one like what we actually got. Is it a perfect idea? No. And I know that the very idea of bringing Cortana back, let alone making her the antagonist, is a heresy in and of itself for so many fans, and thus this idea would be dead on arrival for them, and I understand that. But coming off of Halo 4, where could you really go with the story that would build off of what was done there with John's character in a meaningful way? Unfortunately, that's not the Halo 5 we got, and 343 were well aware of the viscerally negative response to the story we did get. But with such major developments in the world and story having already been applied, how are they going to square this circle? In a bold move, Halo Infinite sidesteps the created storyline completely, taking the Master Chief out of commission for 6 months while Cortana is killed off in the interim. Thus, the story revolves not around the Chief stopping his former friend, but instead finding out what happened to her in the end and, more importantly, finding closure. While there is still the impending threat of the Banished trying to restore Zeta Halo, and the Harbinger trying to bring back the enigmatic Endless, Infinite's story is much more focused on the Master Chief as a character, building off of his growth from Halo 4, and how the events of Halo 5 affected him. To help narrow this focus, the UNSC has been scattered and all but defeated, with the Infinity being brought down in the game's opening moments. As a result, the Chief doesn't have any returning allies, and their ultimate fates are unclear. Instead, we have 2 new characters, Echo 216, the pilot who finds Chief adrift in space and brings him out of stasis, and the Weapon, an infiltration AI who is supposed to lock down Cortana for deletion, who herself bears more than a passing resemblance with the Chief's former AI comrade. Both characters are here for specific purposes in furthering the Chief's character arc, with the pilot serving as a proxy for humanity, with whom the Chief can commiserate and connect to his own humanity, while the weapon serves as a painful reminder of who he's lost. These two aspects of the Chief's character are joined by a third, the Chief as a soldier, which has been very clearly defined through his actions going all the way back to the Bungie trilogy, and challenged in both Halos 4 and 5. And despite his defeat at the hands of Atriox at the very start, which puts him out of commission for 6 months, and Escherum's attempts to goad him into a confrontation throughout the story, the Chief's identity as a soldier is unflappable. Not only is his first response to any immediate threat a direct action to terminate said threat, but his tendency to do so is lampshaded in dialogue, which simultaneously highlights the amusement because it's a video game, and how tragic his character really is.
You got family, Chief? Anyone special out there?
No,
Then why do you do this? Again and again.
it's all I know.
In fact, it's his unwavering commitment to his duty as a soldier which creates tension with Echo 216. From the moment they meet, the pilot is reticent to do much more than ferry the Chief around the open world, despite how excited he was to find humanity's savior floating amongst the rubble in space. But he makes it clear from the off that the reason he was excited wasn't because he thought that humanity had a fighting chance against the Banished, but because the Master Chief, savior of humanity, would be able to get him home. And at first, it can feel tiresome hearing him detest the constant threat of danger, being so unwilling to do what he ostensibly signed up to do. But it's around the midpoint of the story that we pull back the curtain on why he was on the Infinity in the first place. He's not a soldier like the Chief, and by extension the player, thought he was. He was a civilian contractor, an engineer doing his part to help with the war effort. But when he heard that the Chief was taken out by Atriox, he lost hope and stole a Pelican in a scramble to get off the Infinity alive. He is, very explicitly, not a soldier. This cements his place in the narrative as a representation for humanity as a whole, going off the Chief's unconscious separation of soldiers from humanity at the end of Halo 4. But why then would the pilot be so reticent about helping the Chief in his mission when he knows that he's humanity's savior? Why wouldn't he put his faith in the greatest hero he's ever known? Why won't he trust the Master Chief with his life? To answer that question, we have to understand why soldiers trust the Master Chief. It'd be easy enough to say it's because he's a badass cyborg who can decimate entire armies single-handedly, but there's a bit more to it than that. In the original trilogy, whenever the player, as the Master Chief, rolls up to a group of Marines, they'll usually comment on his presence in some way, and their morale goes up.
Good to see you, sir. Welcome to the party. Cavalry has
It's a mess, sir.
We're with you, Chief.
Yeah, get some.
This bit of flavor is elevated just a bit further in the opening of Crow's Nest in Halo 3, where a small group of wounded soldiers takes notice of the Chief's presence, and instantly their moods rise from quiet and dour to an affirmation that everything is going to be okay.
Check it out.
No way. A Spartan?
For real, you better not be.
Oh man, he's here. We're gonna be
Where did you
alright.
find him?
Napping, out back.
And that's just from seeing a Spartan, not even knowing that it's the fabled Master Chief. The Chief has earned the respect and admiration of other soldiers by proving himself to be a capable soldier, someone with whom they have seemingly similar life experience, but also someone who has proven time and again that, while the enemy is tough, they aren't invincible. And while he may be the savior of humanity, the truth is that he hasn't had a life outside the military in over 40 years, not since he was a small child. To put it succinctly, he hasn't connected with humanity like he has with other soldiers, and his combat prowess doesn't serve him as well in earning the pilot's trust as it did, say, Sergeant Johnson's. If anything, the Chief's cold efficiency serves to further alienate him, causing the pilot to lash out in frustration and defiance. And while he does come around, it's only after the Chief tries to connect with him on his level. It's only by allowing himself to be vulnerable, to take a moment to open up emotionally as best he can about why he's pushing himself so hard, that he's able to inspire confidence in his reluctant comrade, by peeling back his own metaphorical armor, by showing his own latent humanity. The Master Chief is able to gain the trust and devotion of humanity, just like how showing his capabilities as a soldier earned him the admiration and devotion of other soldiers.
We all fail. We all make mistakes. It's what makes us human.
I'm sorry, Chief, but how have you ever failed?
I should have protected Cortana. stopped everything from going wrong. I failed her. I will not fail you.
And as the cherry on top, he doesn't other himself from humanity, consciously or otherwise, in doing so. What Lasky said to him in Halo 4 about soldiers being people got through to him, and while he doesn't exactly wear his heart on his sleeve, he doesn't have to. Merely showing that he's capable of this level of emotional maturity, self-awareness, and introspection, the ability to reflect on his own decisions, how he could have done things differently, and how these things still haunt him, is enough to show that he isn't just a machine. He's just as flawed as anybody else, just as human as anyone else. But it's one thing to acknowledge his own emotional damage, it's another thing entirely to work on it. The weapon is very obviously a new version of Cortana, a fact which is not only confirmed later in the narrative, but readily apparent to both new and returning players. They look similar, they're both voiced by Jen Taylor, and they share certain mannerisms and turns of phrase. This is all deliberate, both narratively and thematically. Because of this, the Chief struggles to emotionally and mentally separate her from Cortana, leading to him trying to keep his distance from her in both regards. But the weapon, despite her slight ineptitude at catching social cues, picks up on this, and interrogates the Chief about why he doesn't trust her, resulting in this slip.
I trusted you. Why can't you do the same?
You don't understand.
Try me.
Cortana,
He's gone. Dead. All that's left are echoes, and sooner or later they'll be gone too.
will they?
It doesn't help that he knows exactly what she is and has to explain her own origins to her as well. She's not just a new version of Cortana. She's basically Cortana as a blank slate with a bunch of info stripped out to prevent her from being compromised. Just like he says, the weapon is Cortana if they'd never met. But personality-wise, while she shares similarities, she's far from a carbon copy. Whereas Cortana was far more confident and socialized, the weapon is a bit more awkward and naive, but nonetheless is just as capable as her older sister. And while her dynamic with the Chief is flipped in some ways, it's the same in others. The Chief is more knowledgeable about the Banished, Cortana, and social cues to a degree, but the weapon is still infiltrating Banished and Forerunner systems and gathers intel covertly like Cortana before her. Their relationship is different, but not different enough for the Chief to look at her and see someone other than Cortana, hence the slip. This works on two levels. First, it retains a certain level of comfort for longtime fans who wanted a return to form for Halo's storytelling, more specifically in-game dialogue, since now they have Jen Taylor back in their ear. And second, it helps to align our perspective with the Chief's that much more. The Chief knows this isn't Cortana. We know this isn't Cortana. And we're regularly reminded of this whenever we go through one of the many recusant data clusters Cortana left behind. And yet, we still can't help but be reminded of Cortana whenever we see the weapon or hear her voice. Again, this is deliberate, and highlighted from the moment we meet her. The Chief doesn't put her data chip into his helmet automatically as part of a cutscene. The player has to confirm the action themselves, putting the onus of accepting her into the vacant role once filled by Cortana on us. We have to accept her for this mission, but like the Chief, that doesn't necessarily mean we're going to immediately trust her. And we're given just enough reason to not trust her initially. Not only is she a replacement for a beloved character, but she still theoretically has the potential to turn traitor just like Cortana. And it's reason enough for the Chief not to fully trust her either. And her refusal to go quietly when he initiates her deactivation protocol when the Harbinger has her cornered seems to only bolster this distrust. But when she sees the worst of what Cortana's done, and the Chief tells her what she is, she's distraught by the possibility that she could become just as bad as her, if she hasn't already become her. Despite the Chief saying that this mission is to make sure that doesn't happen, she asks him to delete her anyway, like originally planned, only asking that he saves a captured Echo 216.
I've restored the deletion protocols. I'm ready. It has been an honor. Just promise me one thing.
Whatever happens, save him. He needs you. You're all he has.
And yet, despite not trusting her, he doesn't delete her. He raises her up as a partner, telling her that whatever they're doing it together. This is the moment when the Chief and the weapon truly become a team. Before this, he maintained an emotional distance, holding back information and closing himself off. But over the course of this particular mission, he opens up to her gradually as she prods him, laying bare the sense of guilt and responsibility he feels over what happened to Cortana.
How could she do that?
It's my fault.
How?
I should have stopped it. I could have reasoned with her.
Could you? It was her choice, her programming.
Was it? I don't know anymore.
Maybe in her moment of personal crisis, the Chief finally saw her as someone other than Cortana. Cortana would never have had an identity crisis like this. Even as she was being tortured by the Gravemind or when she fell into rampancy, she knew who she was despite the exponential splintering of her personality. But the weapon is scared, insecure, lonely. All because of what the Chief has told her and how they've interacted. The antithesis of Cortana when she was with him. Seeing her so vulnerable may have proved to him that she isn't Cortana, and thus was reason enough not to delete her. Before, the weapon reminded him too much of Cortana, making it difficult for him to trust her. But now, well...
I don't. But I want to.
This, to me, is easily the strongest aspect of 343's Halo, the Master Chief as a flawed human being, rather than just a cypher. And it didn't come from nowhere. And I had known that for nearly as long as I had been playing these games. But perhaps it's been too long since I had been enveloped in that side of the franchise. Maybe it's time that I got reacquainted. A common complaint levied against Halos 4 and 5 was the over-reliance on extended universe materials in order to understand their stories on a fundamental level. I discussed this in a bit more detail in my Halo 4 video, but the short version is that I find this criticism is often applied a bit too broadly. Halo 4 has elements of the extended universe weaved into its narrative, but nothing so deeply ingrained that one would need to have engaged with any of it to understand what's most important to the story being told. While Halo 5 relied far too heavily on familiarity with the extended canon and lore for players who only experience the game's stories to keep up. It's still a valid criticism, just one that's far more valid towards one title versus the other. I also mentioned how I had kept up with Halo's novels up until about 2011, with the last book I had read being Greg Bear's Cryptum, the first in a trilogy of books about the Forerunners and more specifically the Didact. In the 10 years between the release of Cryptum and Infinite, I hadn't read a single one of the dozens of books, novellas, or comics that had been published, nor had I gone back to reread anything from before. So when working on this video, I had an idea. I was going to play Infinite's campaign twice, once without any brushing up on the expanded universe, and a second time after refamiliarizing myself with a selection of EU materials I had read in the past, and select entries that were completely new to me. I want to make clear right off the bat that knowledge of the extended canon is in no way required to understand Infinite's story. If anything, it'll enrich what's already there simply through having additional insight into the Master Chief's character that doesn't come through often in the games. But if you come into it having only played the games, you won't miss anything important. You'll still have a complete story. So what did I read? Well, I reread Eric Nyland's The Fall of Reach and First Strike, then Contact Harvest and the novella Shadow of Intent, both written by original Halo writer Joseph Staten. After that was the Master Chief Story series, starting with the initial comic, Collateral Damage, written by Alex Irvine, then Troy Denning's Silent Storm, Oblivion, and Shadows of Reach. I also read a select few issues of the comic Escalation, where the Chief reunites with Blue Team and defeats the Didact for realsies, parts of Tales from Slipspace, and the Halo Wars 2 prequel comic The Rise of Atriox, before finally playing the campaign of Halo Wars 2 for the very first time. I chose each of these for one of three reasons. either to deepen my understanding of the Master Chief as a character, gain background knowledge on the Banished, or to familiarize myself with Joe Staten's writing style. Staten was brought on late in Infinite's development as the new head of creative at 343 Industries to wrap up the campaign and negotiate to get the studio an additional year of development time. For those unaware, Staten had done this before when Halo 2's development was similarly in crisis mode back in 2003, but we'll talk more about his contributions to the franchise shortly. It's fairly common knowledge at this point that the Master Chief and the rest of the Spartan 2s were kidnapped as children to be forcibly conscripted into the program. This aspect of his backstory was never even hinted at in the Bungie games, but 343's titles have made no secret of this. Halo 4 even opened up with a cinematic that establishes this aspect of the program to players unfamiliar with the EU. But something that's never addressed in the games is how John feels about this. Halo 5 gives us a slight idea of how he might feel about it when he responds to Cortana's plans.
I'm offering people a chance to be more than they are naturally.
Like Dr. Halsey did for me.
Which indicates that he detests what's been done to him and is fully cognizant of how horribly unethical the program was. This is half true. In Shadows of Reach, which acts as a direct lead-in to Infinite, John's inner monologue tells us that while he has made peace with what's been done to him and the other Spartan 2s, and is in fact quite proud of what he's become as a result, he does not wish for any other child to go through any similar experience. Despite once being a child soldier, he is unambiguously against them, and wants to make sure that nobody feels like they have to arm children for war. It's why he's glad that the Spartan 4 program operates the way it does. The program recruits already active service members rather than kidnapping children like the 2 and 3 programs. The Chief has a strong respect for the 3s and 4s and doesn't consider them to be lesser than those of his own Spartan class. But he is also acutely aware of his particular status among the UNSC and humanity at large as a galactic hero. When he and Blue Team are on Reach on a mission to retrieve some assets from Halsey's old lab that could stop Cortana, they find a group of settlers who instantly recognize who he is and mistakenly assume he's there to save them from the occupying Banished forces. While among them, he ruminates on his status as a hero and how he can only come to others' aid for so long before he becomes too old and slow to continue the fight. After all, he's in his late 40s. John believes that his legacy should live on through those he inspires to be the best versions of themselves, which author Troy Denning supports with the character of First Lieutenant Max Chapov, who over the course of the story grows from a barely competent greenhorn who has trouble following protocol to a capable soldier who ultimately gives his life for the mission. And yet, for all his victories, the Master Chief is still haunted by the loss of every soldier under his command. The most significant has been Samuel 034, the first Spartan 2 to be killed in action in the early days of the Covenant War. Sam was part of John's original team in boot camp alongside Kelly 087, and it was through young John's own arrogance and the team's subsequent punishment for said arrogance that the bonds between them would ultimately be forged. It was through their shared struggle in those early days that John learned the value of teamwork, that he only wins if his team wins. John saw the other Spartans as his brothers and sisters, but Sam was a cut above the rest. Alongside Kelly, he was one of John's best friends and one of the most promising Spartans, being both the tallest and strongest of them all, as well as a natural leader. But shortly after they recovered from their augmentations, he was deployed with several other Spartans, including John and Kelly, to infiltrate and destroy a Covenant ship that had appeared in orbit over Chi-Ceti 4 while they were being outfitted with their first suit of Mjolnir armor. During the mission, Sam was hit by an overcharged plasma bolt that was heading for John, which melted a hole in his armor and ruptured the vacuum suit underneath, rendering it impossible for him to leave the ship. He stayed behind, guarding the engine to prevent the Covenant from disarming the payload the Spartans had brought on board while the rest escaped. Sam was successful, and the ship was destroyed, but his success cost him his life. He was only 14 years old. Sam's death was both tragic and inspirational. Tragic because he was the first Spartan to be killed in action and the first major loss John felt, but inspirational in that his sacrifice proved the Covenant were not invincible. He had emboldened his brothers and sisters, and in a way the rest of the UNSC when it was decided that he wouldn't be officially listed as KIA, but rather MIA, missing in action, which began the unofficial doctrine of Spartans never die. John felt personally responsible for his comrade's death. He would have nightmares about it, wishing he hadn't been so careless that Sam would have had to take the shot for him in the first place. And even as he made peace with Sam's death later in life, he still carried the weight of it for decades. This is briefly brought to the forefront in Infinite when the Chief activates the weapon's termination protocol, where the 3 verification codes to confirm her deletion are, in order, Red Flag, the ill-fated mission to capture a Covenant ship and have the Spartan 2's raid High Charity, that was iced when Reach was attacked and most of Red Team died, 034, Sam's number, and Samuel, the latter of which John hesitates to vocalize. When he does, he says it quickly and quietly, almost as though he's struggling not to relive the events of that day.
Samuel.
You said... I thought we were a team.
It helps that Steve Downes approaches his performance as the Master Chief differently than in the Bungie era. Back then, the only direction he was ever really given was that he was a Clint Eastwood man-with-no-name type character. Says very little, but every word is important. But afterwards, he dug a little deeper into the character's background and came out the other end with a renewed perspective which would inform his approach going forward.
Somebody in the earlier segment was asking me some of my favorite books, and I neglected to mention that the Fall of Reach, #1, is a book that really drastically changed the way I approached the character to Master Chief, because that was the backstory, right? That filled in all the blanks. Through reading the books, especially The Fall of Reach, it was quite informative as to how Master Chief came to be who he was. If you look at the Chief just from watching the cutscenes in the games or even the gameplay, he can come across as a fairly one-dimensional, character. But if you dig a little deeper and you peel the onion back just a little bit, there's a lot more going on, and Master Chief ends up being, a fairly complex personality who's been through some very traumatic moments in his life. Beginning as a child, basically being kidnapped, and then being, physically augmented and changed through, biomechanics and whatnot to become this Superman. Experiences like that are gonna affect you. Don't you think? I mean, they're gonna and perhaps scar you, and that's why his relationship with Dr. Halsey is a complicated one. The relationship between him and Cortana, of course, is a very interesting, and like I said, for me, a very deep and complex one. And now with the weapon, it takes on this whole nother level of complexity. So he's a very interesting character, much more interesting than perhaps people give him credit for.
343 has done wonders with developing the Chief's character by using the extended fiction as a springboard, and while Halo 5 did little with this in favor of throwing elements of that fiction at players without necessary context, Infinite brings us back around to this excellent character work without needing the player to be familiar with anything other than just the games. But these stories aren't conjured from nothing. They're written by people, and game development, like filmmaking, is a collaborative process. Writers write the scripts, but producers, directors, and other creative leads often make changes to what's presented to them, and how that script is presented in an audiovisual medium can further alter the intentions of the writers through the use of cinematography, sound design, and editing. That said, when developing a story that's told over multiple installments, it would be ideal to have consistency among the creative team, and during the Bungie era, Halo had exactly that. While the writers of Combat Evolved wouldn't be writing for the rest of the Bungie games, the game's cinematics director would. Joseph Staten was the sole credited writer for Halo 2, co-wrote Halo 3 alongside Luke Smith and Robert McLeese with contributions from other staff members, was the sole writer and director of ODST, and co-wrote Halo Reach with Peter O'Brien, all while still directing cinematics. In addition to cinematography that would heighten the series' presentation, Staten's contribution to the franchise in its first decade would help elevate Halo beyond a mechanically revolutionary military sci-fi shooter. Halo 2 gave players a look behind the curtain at what the Covenant are like, what drives them, and who calls the shots, all from the perspective of a disgraced member of their warrior class who slowly grapples with his own unraveling faith in the wake of a civil war. Halo 3, while written by committee under duress, tugged at players' heartstrings with Cortana's plight. ODST was a story of survival driven by its human cast, with the friction between Buck and Dare at the center of it. And Reach was a story of doing the best one can in the face of impossible odds. And then there are his literary contributions to the franchise, the previously mentioned Contact Harvest and Shadow of Intent. Contact Harvest follows Sergeant Johnson during first contact with the Covenant, the struggles of training a colonial militia with limited time and equipment, and the efforts to save as many people from the Covenant's assault on Harvest as possible. There are also several subplots about two AIs who take comfort in each other's presence as the world goes to hell around them, a grunt and an engineer's friendship as they look out for each other's well-being aboard a brute ship, and the perspective of those brutes, specifically Tartarus from Halo 2 and his uncle Maccabeus, as the situation with the humans unfolds. The novella Shadow of Intent follows Urtas Vadum, the Arbiter's half-jawed comrade, as he investigates a prelate warrior seeking revenge against him for not saving his family from the flood on High Charity, a tragedy Urtas had nothing to do with and couldn't have saved the prelate's family even if he had known about them. Staten's writing leans strongly on characters to keep the player or reader emotionally engaged, which should be the goal of any story. And while he wasn't a credited writer for Halo Infinite, which itself has carried over no writers from 4 or 5, he was brought on as campaign project lead and later made head of creative for 343 Industries at large in summer 2020, meaning that he would ultimately control what would be done with the game's narrative, even if he wasn't writing the script himself. That being said, Infinite does have stripes of Bungie-era Halo in its narrative, specifically in its character work, as I've already described in detail up to this point. But there are parts of the story I haven't dug into up until now, one of them being Escharum and the Banished. Originally created as the antagonists of Halo Wars 2, the Banished are a collective of mercenaries and outlaws under the leadership of Atriox, a brute chieftain who had been excommunicated from the Covenant during the war for his lack of faith and refusal to die with his pack in the name of the Great Journey. The Banished are not a religious organization. The only authority they recognize is strength. As such, there is no species-based caste system, it's largely a meritocracy. As savage as they are, however, Atriox was no simple barbarian. He was a bit of a philosopher as well as a capable warrior, interrogating his enemies' devotion to their faith when confronted and offering them a chance to set down their weapons and join him at any time. Escharum was Atriox's mentor of sorts when he was still with the Covenant, and has become the leader of the Banished upon his pupil's supposed death. Unlike Atriox, Escharum despises humans and believes they don't have a place among the Banished, but like his pupil, he enjoys the thrill of combat and relishes the opportunity to test his mettle. He has fought and killed many Spartans, and as time wore on and he's grown older, he's also grown weary and bored with weak prey as the Spartans fell. His spirit is reinvigorated when he finds that the Master Chief survived his encounter with Atriox. He sees the Chief as his last chance for a truly great fight, and so sends his closest compatriot, a Spartan killer, to monitor him. When it becomes clear that the Chief won't face Escharum just for the sake of it, he has his associate capture the pilot to lure the Chief into a confrontation. This is the capstone Escharum desires for his legacy, a legendary battle against the greatest warrior humanity has to offer. The greatest of the Spartans, the one who broke the Covenant almost single-handedly. This battle, just as Escharum described, is legendary. Not in the sense that it's a grandiose or standout moment in the game that will be fondly talked about by fans for years to come, but because it's the culmination of what he has personally sought this whole time. Sure, he wanted the Banished to restore the ring so they'd have control of a superweapon. The Banished crave power, it makes sense. But Escharum wanted one final battle for the ages, the teacher of Atriox, the new leader of the Banished, cementing his legend by being the one to defeat the legendary Master Chief. Despite Escherum's own disgust of humans, there's no animosity here. He doesn't hate the Chief or have any personal vendetta against him. His interest in defeating the Chief is born out of his desire to cement his legacy among the Banished and his people. At least, what's left of his people after Cortana destroyed their homeworld. With the knowledge that Doisak is gone and the brutes are now almost certainly endangered, it makes sense that Escharum would want to leave behind a legacy that would outlive his people. He doesn't know how much longer his species has left until they're extinct, or if there's a chance at all that they could find a new world and settle and repopulate. He's not just fighting for glory, he's fighting to survive. If not physically, then in the memories of those who hear his story. Why do you think his last words were,
"My death will inspire 1,000 others. Tell them I died well."
The Banished themselves are boring as all hell, and their lack of a real presence in the extended canon doesn't help. But Escharum is a fascinating character, and a more than suitable enemy for the Master Chief, a dark reflection of what he could have become. Think about it. Both are skilled warriors, among the best their respective species have produced, inspiring countless soldiers and warriors in the wake of their deeds. Both have lost something or someone near and dear to them. The Chief lost Cortana, who has effectively scattered and destroyed the UNSC, and Escharum lost Atriox, his greatest student, as well as his home. Both are growing old and have been fighting for practically their entire lives, but they respond very differently to all of these circumstances. They're both acutely aware of their respective status among their own people, but whereas the Chief continues to operate as he always had, never throwing his weight around or using his reputation to his advantage, Escharum regularly boasts about the Banished's accomplishments and tries to intimidate his enemies. The Chief's response to losing Cortana was introspective, blaming himself and thinking over and over about what he could have done differently and what he should have done to prevent her turn. After losing Doisak and Atriox, Escharum lashed out against the world and those near him in a nihilistic manner. When made aware of their age, the Chief accepts that he will eventually need to stop doing this, but wants to be sure that he inspires others to be the best soldiers they can be for when that day comes. And while Escharum also wants his legend to inspire others, it's not for the sake of some greater good or to fill the hole he leaves behind. He wants to become a legend for the sake of being remembered. If not as an individual, then to at least keep his people alive in memory and not be wiped away like their home planet was. The Chief shows him some modicum of respect in his final moments because, like Escharum, he also realizes how similar they really are. So much so that the Chief even projects his own human tendencies onto Escharum.
I don't understand. You showed him respect. He was a monster.
Yes. But at the end, he was just a soldier. Hoping he'd done the right thing. Questioning his choices.
But this isn't where the story ends. There's still one major player left in Halo Infinite who I've mentioned a few times, but have yet to properly discuss. And truly, she's the one who ties everything together. Each of 343's main Halo titles have introduced a new antagonist. For Halo 4, it was the Didact, a forerunner who held a grudge against humanity and had been sealed away for it. While the antagonist of Halo 5 was Cortana, she was only able to accomplish her goals through the Guardians. And in Infinite, we have the Harbinger, an alien who had been sealed away by the Forerunners who seeks to unleash a new threat into the galaxy that supposedly surpasses that of the Flood, the enigmatic Endless. Most people would tell you that the Harbinger is a wasted character and that her presence does little to enhance the story, adding only a frustrating boss fight tacked on at the end before we even see the terrible Endless she goes on about, which don't even appear, effectively being all set up with no payoff. And if you're taking the story at face value, you'd be correct. By the end, we still don't know what the Endless are exactly, and getting any concrete information on them is relegated to optional audio logs the player has to go out and find themselves. But we don't just take things at face value here. We have to look at how and when the Harbinger is presented, what happens immediately before, during, and after her encounters with the Master Chief. Her presence is first implied to the Chief just after the mission where he finds the weapon and is reminded of the day he and Cortana first met. The first time he comes face to face with the Harbinger is after he learns about Cortana practically imprisoning the Monitor. Then again when she tries to subdue the weapon while she's in the ring's systems, prompting the Chief to attempt to deactivate his companion, leading to a dissolution of trust. And their final confrontation at the end of the story takes place in the very room where Cortana died. This is where the Chief sees Cortana, via data cluster, begin to set plans to, as she puts it, make things right. By this point, he's not only regained the weapon's trust, but also opened up to her about the guilt he feels over what happened to Cortana. And that's the keyword here. Guilt. The Harbinger describes herself as the harbinger of the truth, combating the lies of the Forerunners, that she will usher the return of the Endless. But the Endless are given no actual presence in the narrative, and they're described only as being worse than the Flood, a check that this story would have a very difficult time trying to cash, if it was trying to cash it in the first place. It isn't, by the way. All of this is just a way of grounding the game's central metaphor in the lore of the Halo universe. So what are the Endless really? An adjective, a descriptor. They are what John has been holding back internally this whole time. This Harbinger isn't one of truth. She's the Harbinger of endless guilt, an all-consuming feeling of despair brought on by failure and regret. It's why we never actually see the Endless. They're an abstraction of John's understood but unprocessed emotions. It's why, until now, he hasn't properly fought the Harbinger. He hasn't been emotionally prepared for it until he started to trust his companion enough to open up to her about his guilt, the very emotion the Harbinger and the Endless represent. He can't fight them until he sees that Cortana hadn't completely lost herself in the end. And it's only after he sees those glimmers of who she once was that he's able to directly confront his guilt, and only after he conquers it is he able to see Cortana as she truly was and find closure.
Look at us. We just keep saying goodbye, don't we? But this isn't an end. It's a chance to make amends, to rectify mistakes. It starts here. Together you become our newfound hope.
What do I call her?
Ask her. She named herself. Hello, Master Chief. I'm Cortana. She will do anything necessary to make sure that your mission is accomplished, even if that means sacrificing herself to accomplish it. I thought that I could do this on my own.
I don't want to chance a remote detonation. I need to stay here.
After I'm through with truth.
Don't make a girl a promise if you know you can't keep it.
But I forgot that the entire reason that I chose you in the first place was that we were supposed to be a team.
Earth is all we have left. You trust Cortana that much?
Sir. Yes, sir.
Don't let her go. Don't ever let her go.
Perfectly suited, perfectly matched, perfectly perfect.
I will not allow you to leave this planet!
I am ordering you
To surrender that AI!
No, sir.
Your compassion for mankind is misplaced.
I'm not doing this for mankind.
It was my job to take care of you.
We were supposed to take care of each other, and we did.
I need to make sure you two learn from my mistakes.
The mantle of responsibility for the galaxy shelters all, but only the created are its masters.
I should have protected Cortana. Stopped everything from going wrong. I failed her. I will not fail you.
I'm her. Will I do what she did? Become what she became?
My mission was to ensure that doesn't happen.
Become stronger because of them. How can you trust me?
I don't, but I want to.
I chose well, Master Chief. I really did. Now, it's up to you. Are you all right? I don't know what to say. Scratch that!
In the end, Cortana ends up saving John and the weapon, and we end with the two of them reuniting with Echo 216 once again. And before the credits roll, we get a capstone for both John and the weapon's character arcs. For John, we hear his old leitmotif from Halo 2 score the scene, signifying his new emotional resolve, and the weapon is given the opportunity to name herself, just as her older sister had done many years ago. She turns to the Chief, asking if the name she has in mind would be okay. Further solidifying his growth, he tells her that whether she chooses that name is up to her. We're not told what name she has in mind, but given her character arc and her smile, the implication is that she will choose the name Cortana. In the end, the Master Chief and Cortana are, in a way, reunited, and they're ready to get back to work, fighting the Banished off of Zeta Halo, rebuilding the UNSC, and continuing to protect humanity. If it wasn't obvious by now, I love Halo Infinite's story. It picks up on what was started in Halo 4 and cast aside by 5, and brought it to the forefront. But I'm all too aware that I'm probably in the minority with this opinion, which is why I've been careful with my wording throughout this video. When discussing Infinite's narrative directly, I deliberately never once used the word campaign. This was to prevent conflating the story with the overall gameplay experience. And that's because, as a whole, Infinite's campaign is far from perfect. The open world clashes with the personal story being put front and center, creating a disconnect between the large scale of the play space and the micro scale of the story really being told. The gameplay itself is solid and the boss fights aren't too shabby either, but the environments both in the open world and instanced interior missions have little variation. This, combined with a lack of major set pieces, makes the game's individual missions and even the chronology of story beats blur together. And for those who are interested in the macro narrative of the Halo series, there's a distinct sense that anything of note that happens in the story happens entirely off-screen, and little is actually accomplished by the end. This is compounded by a point I brought up earlier about each mainline game from 343 Industries introducing a new antagonist. Specifically, there's a sentiment that each of these games, Halos 4, 5, and Infinite, have all attempted to effectively reboot the Halo story in response to poor reception of their previous game. And there is some amount of truth to that, especially here. The backlash to 5's story was immense, so much so that you'll find very few attempts to expand on the implication of those events from that story in the extended canon. At most, Cortana and her Guardians will be looming in the background beyond the scope of a given story in the EU, but that's pretty much it. And the culmination of this is Infinite just getting rid of them off screen so fans can move past it all. This creates a narrative disconnect, considering how massive the scale of those events must have been relative to how seemingly carelessly they were disposed of, but it was honestly a no-win situation for 343. If they kept going with it, the many fans who hated this direction wouldn't be interested in the story going forward. If anything, they'd likely outright resent it. If they pulled the plug on such a narrative shakeup too early or without really exploring it, it would be even less satisfying on a narrative level. But they could potentially win back at least some of the crowd in doing so. I think they took the better option and turned those lemons into lemonade by turning the focus back on the Master Chief and his own emotional damage, which Halo 5 hardly touched upon. And to me, that's the biggest triumph of Halo Infinite. Not just of its campaign, but of the whole package. Sure, the actual design and structure of the campaign aren't exactly conducive to the story and are extremely repetitive. Yeah, trying to get the player to accept Cortana's redemption after she destroyed Doisak is maybe asking a bit too much. And of course, there will be players who will feel blueballed by Atriox's unceremonious exit from the story, the lack of a macro-narrative payoff for the Endless, and the use of audio logs to fill in the details of what happened to characters from the past games and other background events of this game. But to get hung up on all that is like getting hung up on the disposal of the angels and Sele in the last 2 episodes of Evangelion. It's missing the forest for the trees. At its core, Halo Infinite's story is exactly what the series needed after 4's climax nearly a decade ago, keeping that game's promise of deepening the Master Chief as a character, and proving that he is, at his core, truly human.